Judge Boasberg thought he was untouchable, but Pam Bondi exposed his secret rulings in minutes, and it ended his career. You won't believe what just happened. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. The media wasn't expecting much that morning. A few state reporters shuffled into the conference room in Tallahassee, most of them assuming it would be a typical commentary session. Former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi had announced a press appearance, but without specifics. Nothing in the press release hinted at controversy. That changed the moment she stepped up to the microphone. She looked composed, confident, and above all, prepared. In her hand was a thin stack of documents, and on her face, a look that said she wasn't here to talk about politics. She waited until the room quieted, then spoke clearly. This isn't about party lines. This isn't about policy. This is about process and the integrity of our legal system. A few reporters leaned forward. Over the past several months, certain judicial actions have come to my attention. These actions have interfered with lawful procedures, particularly concerning immigration enforcement. And while I have tried to seek internal clarity, I have not received sufficient answers. She paused, giving the room a moment to absorb it. Today, I am raising a public concern about a pattern of judicial behavior that cannot go unchecked. I'm referring specifically to rulings issued by Judge James Boasberg of the federal bench. The room froze. Judge Boasberg wasn't an unknown name. He had served for years, handling sensitive cases related to immigration, surveillance, and federal enforcement. Many within the legal community viewed him as above scrutiny, until now. No one had publicly questioned the impartiality of his courtroom. Pam Bondi didn't hesitate. I have reviewed multiple cases where critical procedural steps were skipped, filings that were never acknowledged, hearings that were canceled without explanation, and rulings that, without transparency, delayed the execution of lawful deportation orders. A few reporters began taking rapid notes. One raised a hand, but Bondi continued, determined not to be interrupted. I want to be clear. I am not accusing Judge Boasberg of criminal wrongdoing at this time. What I am doing is raising red flags that deserve the full attention of the Judicial Review Board and the public. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. Behind the cameras, there was silence. No one had anticipated this. Bondi wasn't simply commenting on policy, she was questioning a sitting federal judge's conduct in open view. And while she wasn't delivering charges, the message was clear. She believed something was very wrong inside Boasberg's courtroom. What made the moment more powerful was Bondi's tone. She wasn't dramatic, she didn't shout, she simply laid out facts, calmly, methodically. Several of these cases involved individuals flagged for immediate removal under federal immigration priorities, and yet, due to unexplained judicial decisions, these removals were stalled or quietly dismissed. In every instance I've reviewed, procedural norms were ignored or quietly bypassed. After finishing her statement, she handed the documents to the press. These include anonymized case summaries, docket timelines, and excerpts from rulings. I encourage every member of the media here to read them carefully. A reporter finally got a question in. Are you saying Judge Boasberg intentionally interfered with deportation efforts? Bondi didn't flinch. I'm saying these aren't isolated oversights. They form a pattern that may suggest a deliberate obstruction of lawful enforcement, and that deserves a deeper look. Another question came immediately. Why bring this to the public now? Bondi didn't hesitate. Because internal processes have stalled, requests for transparency have gone unanswered. If those responsible for oversight aren't willing to act behind closed doors, then the public deserves to know what's being ignored. Within 2 hours, the press conference was on every major news site. Cable channels aired excerpts, legal analysts debated the implications. The story spread not just because of what Bondi said, but because of who she was. She wasn't a partisan commentator. She had once held real power, and she knew the judicial system from the inside. If she was sounding the alarm, people listened. Judge Boasberg's office issued a brief statement that afternoon. It read, in part, Judge Boasberg remains committed to the fair and impartial administration of justice. He stands by his record and welcomes any appropriate review of his decisions. Bondi wasn't surprised. In fact, she had expected exactly that response. What she didn't say publicly, at least not yet, was that she had more documents, more testimony, and a particularly troubling email chain she hadn't yet mentioned to the press. For now, she was holding it back, because this wasn't a one-day headline. This was the beginning of something bigger. She knew what she had discovered, but she also knew that if she revealed it too early, the system would protect itself before the truth could surface. Timing would be everything, and so she let the pressure build. She had pointed the nation toward a judge they once trusted. Now she waited to see who would look closer. The most important detail, the one that connected everything, was still sitting in her private folder. She wasn't ready to reveal it. Not yet. 2 days after the press conference, Pam Bondi sat in a private law office across town, reviewing a folder that hadn't left her side in weeks. It was thick, worn at the edges, and filled with photocopies, handwritten notes, and names not yet made public. Only a few people had seen its contents. Even fewer understood the full picture. Across the table sat a retired immigration officer. His face was tense, his hands folded in his lap. He had requested the meeting quietly through a mutual connection. No reporters, no recordings. "I'm not looking for publicity," he said. "I just want someone to know what really happened." Bondi listened carefully as he described an incident from 6 months earlier, a routine deportation case involving a foreign national with a prior removal order. According to procedure, the individual should have been processed and removed within 48 hours. Instead, a last-minute restraining order came down from Judge Boasberg's court. The removal was blocked. No explanation was offered. No hearing was scheduled. The judge simply signed the order, citing a sealed motion that had never appeared in the public docket. "That's not normal," the officer said. "I've been doing this for 20 years. We're used to delays, appeals, procedural slowdowns. But this was different. It felt prearranged." Bondi flipped through her folder and found the corresponding file. She had already flagged it. The timeline didn't add up. The filing that supposedly triggered the judge's order had no date, no stamp, no public record. Yet the restraining order had been signed and delivered. "Do you know who filed the motion?" she asked. "That's the thing," he said. "We don't. The agency never saw it." Bondi sat back in her chair. It wasn't the first time she'd heard something like this, but each testimony added weight, added urgency. Later that day, she met with 2 legal researchers who had been helping her quietly piece together the court patterns. They had compiled a spreadsheet that listed every ruling Boasberg had made on immigration matters over the past 18 months. The trends were clear. In cases involving emergency stays or deportation blocks, Boasberg had ruled in favor of delay 94% of the time. One of the researchers leaned in. "What's strange is how many of these cases skipped standard procedure. Some had missing docket numbers, others lacked respondent notifications. A few even had conflicting timestamps between court filings and order issuance." Another added, "We double-checked the PACER system. Some of the files literally disappeared and reappeared with changes a few days later. That's not supposed to happen." Bondi looked at the data, quiet. There was a pattern, all right, but it wasn't just judicial discretion. It was systematic. That night, she sat alone at her kitchen table, rereading the internal email chain she had been holding on to. The emails were between a legal assistant in Boasberg's office and an attorney representing a prominent immigration advocacy group. The tone of the exchange was casual, even friendly, but what stood out was the timing. The attorney had referenced a motion they planned to file the following week, yet Boasberg's restraining order in that case had already been signed the day before the filing occurred. Pam tapped the folder. That was the detail no one else had, the one piece that connected the quiet whispers to something actionable. A judge issuing rulings in anticipation of motions that hadn't been filed. That wasn't just irregular, it was deeply unethical. But it still wasn't enough. If she moved too soon, it would be swept under the rug. Boasberg had connections in D.C., he sat on panels, advised clerks, and had relationships in both political parties. To accuse him directly would invite a storm. She needed one more piece, one confirmation that tied the communication to an outcome, something irrefutable. She called a contact inside the Department of Justice, a former colleague who owed her a favor. "I need access to one internal record," she said. "It's from a case last November. The court blocked the deportation of an individual flagged for removal, citing an emergency medical condition. "I remember it," the voice said. "It got some attention internally." "I need to know who flagged the emergency," Bondi said. "The origin of the request. Was it based on court evidence, or did it come from somewhere else?" There was a pause. "I'll see what I can find," the voice replied. She hung up. The press had gone quiet. The headlines were already fading, replaced by newer controversies and political feuds. But that was fine. The quieter things got, the easier it was to work. Pam Bondi wasn't finished, not even close. The pressure was building, exactly as she needed it to. Because when she finally made her next move, it wouldn't be just another press conference. It would be a turning point. And this time, she'd be naming names. 3 days after her meeting with the immigration officer, Pam Bondi received a message on a secure line she hadn't used in months. No caller ID, no name, just a voice that said, "We need to meet, tonight, alone." She didn't ask for details. She already had a feeling. Later that evening, she drove to the outskirts of Tallahassee to a quiet diner off the highway. It was nearly empty when she arrived. She took a booth near the back and waited. 15 minutes later, a woman in her mid-40s walked in, wearing a dark coat and sunglasses, even though the sun had long since set. She didn't introduce herself, just slid into the booth and placed a thin brown envelope on the table. "I don't want to be involved publicly," she said, "but I've worked inside the court for 10 years and I've seen enough." Bondi stayed quiet, letting her speak at her own pace. "I always thought Judge Boasberg was just particular. Strict, maybe even paranoid. But then we started seeing changes in how cases were handled, files disappearing from the system, orders rewritten after being signed, emails sent that didn't match anything in the official records." She glanced around the diner before continuing. "At first, I thought it was just clerical. But then one day, I found something I wasn't supposed to see. A draft ruling, unsigned, on a deportation case that hadn't been filed yet. No case number, no date, just a full decision, already written." Bondi leaned in. "You're saying the judge wrote a ruling before the case was even opened?" The woman nodded slowly. "It was emailed from his private account to his assistant, with instructions to clean it up and insert docket reference once received." Pam opened the envelope. Inside were 3 printed emails, including the draft decision. The language was cautious, but the implication was clear. Judge Boasberg was preparing legal decisions in advance of official case filings, and it didn't stop there. The woman explained how certain attorneys were granted unusual access to chambers, private meetings that weren't logged, motions approved within hours without opposition replies, protective orders issued without proper justification. "You said you didn't want to be involved publicly. Why come forward at all?" "Because I stayed quiet too long," she said, "and now I think it's gone too far. Someone needs to stop it. If you don't, no one will." Pam nodded. She understood the risk. Whistleblowers like this didn't come forward lightly, and if she was right, this was more than a pattern. It was a coordinated abuse of judicial discretion. But one detail still nagged at her. Why would a respected federal judge risk his entire career to block deportations? She asked the question aloud. The woman hesitated. "There are rumors," she said, "about financial ties. Not bribes, at least not directly. But certain nonprofit legal groups have donors, and those donors have interests. The judge's wife sits on the board of one of those groups." Bondi's eyes narrowed. That was new. She closed the envelope and thanked the woman, promising to protect her identity. When she got back to her office, she immediately called one of her researchers. "I need a full profile on the judge's immediate family, especially his wife. Look for any board positions, political donations, or affiliations with immigration advocacy groups. Go back 10 years if you have to." The researcher asked no questions, just said, "Got it," and hung up. The next morning, Bondi returned to the Department of Justice to follow up on her earlier request. Her contact met her in the hallway, looking uneasy. "We checked the internal files," he said. "The emergency stay you asked about, the medical condition that halted the deportation, it didn't come from a doctor. It came from a letter written by a law clerk, and the clerk used the name of a clinic that doesn't exist." Bondi stared at him. "So the justification was fabricated." "It looks that way." She didn't need to hear more. Back in her car, she took a deep breath and realized she had crossed the line from suspicion into certainty. What started as a few irregularities had now evolved into a full-blown judicial scandal. Draft rulings written in advance, sealed motions with no trace, medical emergencies based on fictional clinics. And at the center of it all was a judge who hadn't said a single word in his own defense beyond a vague press statement. There was one move left before going public again. She picked up the phone and dialed the Federal Judicial Review Board. "I have evidence of coordinated judicial misconduct. I'm requesting an immediate review under emergency oversight." The voice on the other end paused, then asked a single question. "Do you have proof?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes." The review board agreed to a closed-door preliminary hearing. Now, it wasn't just a media story. Now it was real. But Bondi still hadn't revealed the one thing that tied it all together: the email she'd been holding. The one written before the ruling was signed, the one that proved intent. She would save that for the hearing. Because once that email was shown, there would be no walking it back, and no more denying what had taken place behind Boasberg's bench. The morning after Pam Bondi filed her emergency request with the Federal Judicial Review Board, Washington started to shift. Not publicly, at least not yet, but inside the legal circles that mattered, the temperature changed. Quiet phone calls, sudden meetings, emails sent with vague subject lines and blind carbon copies. Bondi had tipped the first domino, and the people closest to Judge Boasberg knew it. By noon, his chambers had gone into lockdown. Staff members were told to refer all questions to the court's communications office. No comments, no explanations, just silence. But silence spoke volumes. Bondi wasn't watching the judge's office. She was watching the reaction of the institutions around him, the ones that had shielded him for years. She noticed how quickly former allies began to distance themselves. One federal appellate judge she had known for years sent her a short email. "I'm hearing things. If this escalates, they'll try to minimize. Be ready." That afternoon, her legal researcher returned with a detailed report. Boasberg's wife, a corporate attorney by trade, had recently joined the advisory board of a nonprofit that specialized in legal advocacy for immigrants. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't even hidden. But the group had been directly involved in filing motions in at least 6 cases overseen by Boasberg's court. The connection wasn't proof of wrongdoing, but it was a clear conflict of interest, and he had never disclosed it. Pam folded the report and slid it into the growing file. Everything was stacking up, quietly, carefully, and dangerously. She wasn't surprised when she got the next call. It came from a senior official within the Judicial Review Board, someone who'd previously worked alongside her during her time as Attorney General. "We're reviewing your materials," the voice said. "It's extensive and it's serious. What's the next step?" "Preliminary hearing. Private. Just the board. You present, they listen. No cameras, no media." Bondi knew the drill. The goal wasn't drama, it was validation. If the board found merit in her evidence, they could trigger a formal investigation, one that would strip Boasberg of the legal immunity federal judges often enjoyed. She hung up and started preparing. She would lead with the patterns, the timelines, the vanished dockets, and overlapping rulings, but she would end with the email, the one written before the motion was filed, the one that mentioned the exact language of a ruling that hadn't yet existed. That was her keystone, and she would save it for the final 10 minutes. The hearing was scheduled for Friday morning in a federal building that few people ever noticed. No press, no spectators, just a long wooden table and 5 members of the review board, each of them former prosecutors or retired judges. Bondi arrived early, carrying only her folder. The lead board member, a woman in her 60s with a sharp voice and a reputation for impartiality, welcomed her and gestured for her to begin. Pam spoke clearly, calmly, without notes. She started with the numbers, then the witness testimony, then the procedural gaps. She moved from example to example, each one building on the last. She didn't speculate, she just laid it out. At one point, one of the board members raised an eyebrow. "You're saying the judge knowingly ruled on cases before they were officially submitted?" "I'm saying I have evidence he drafted decisions before the motions were even filed, and that, in at least one case, the motion referenced a medical emergency based on fabricated information." The room went still. Bondi opened the final tab in her folder and pulled out the printed email. This is from Judge Boasberg's personal account to a court assistant. The timestamp is the day before the motion was filed. The email outlines his planned decision and references final language to match advocacy request. The phrase advocacy request is not standard legal language, it's political. The lead board member took the email and read it silently. The rest followed. No one spoke for nearly a minute. When they finished, the lead member looked at Bondi. This is serious. I know. We'll deliberate and notify you of next steps. Bondi nodded and left the room. Outside, the sky was overcast. The streets were quiet. She didn't speak to reporters. No one even knew the hearing had taken place. But by the next morning, the Judicial Review Board had released a one-line statement to federal agencies. We are opening a formal inquiry into Judge James Boasberg based on new credible evidence. That sentence made its way into inboxes across the Justice Department. It didn't go public, but everyone who mattered saw it. Inside Boasberg's chambers, the panic that had started quietly now turned urgent. He hadn't yet responded directly to the allegations, but those around him had started to pull back. One of his former law clerks removed a public endorsement. A law school where he had lectured canceled an upcoming appearance, and his court calendar suddenly went empty. Still, Bondi knew better than to assume victory. He hadn't spoken yet, which meant he wasn't finished. People with power never go down without a response. But now the weight was shifting. She had put the system on notice, and this time, it couldn't pretend it hadn't seen what was coming. By Monday morning, the silence broke. Judge Boasberg released a formal response through his attorney, an unusually aggressive move for someone still sitting on the bench. The statement was polished, measured, and clearly prepared by a legal crisis team. These allegations are deeply misleading, politically motivated, and intentionally designed to undermine the public's trust in the federal judiciary, it read. Judge Boasberg has never acted outside the bounds of law or ethics. Any discrepancies in court records are procedural and not the result of misconduct. It concluded with a warning. Judge Boasberg reserves all rights to pursue legal action in response to defamation. Pam Bondi read it twice. There it is, she said quietly, the counterstrike. He wasn't denying the rulings, he wasn't denying the sealed motions, or the pattern of decisions. He was denying the intent and shifting the narrative, framing her investigation as a personal vendetta or political stunt. She had expected this, but she knew the next step would be critical. That evening, a story appeared in One Gene Z Ed, one of the more partisan media outlets, citing anonymous sources who claimed Bondi had ambitions for a future federal appointment. The implication was clear. She was going after Boasberg to raise her profile. Bondi didn't react publicly. She didn't issue a denial or take the bait. But privately, she met with her team. They're trying to corner me with optics, she said. Make this look like it's about me, not the facts. So how do we respond? One of them asked. We don't. Not directly, not yet. Instead, she instructed her team to do something else. Go back to every case in that 18-month window, identify every immigration ruling he made, build a timeline, cross-reference it with every filing from those advocacy groups we flagged. What are we looking for? A pattern no one can argue with. Over the next 3 days, her researchers worked non-stop, dozens of cases, hundreds of documents, filing timestamps, email records, hearing logs, every irregularity mapped. And what they found was undeniable. Of the 39 restraining orders issued by Boasberg in immigration cases, 25 had identical or near-identical language in their conclusions. Even when the cases involved different plaintiffs and circumstances. The motions were filed by different attorneys, yet the rulings echoed the same phrases, same citations, and same rationale. The orders had been copied. That alone wasn't illegal. Judges often used templates. But when Bondi's team compared the timestamps, they noticed something stranger. In 9 of those cases, the order had been signed within 2 hours of the motion's filing, often before the respondent had filed a single response. No emergency hearings, no judicial comments, just rapid approval, often during off matters. That was procedural malpractice, plain and simple. Worse, in 3 of those cases, Boasberg had added protective clauses that barred public disclosure of the proceedings, a move normally reserved for national security issues or threats to life. Yet none of those cases qualified. Bondi looked over the timeline her team created. It was clean, visually devastating. A string of nearly identical orders rushed through, all benefiting one side. She leaned back. This is what we bring next. That week, she scheduled a follow-up session with the Judicial Review Board. The investigation was already underway, but she wanted them to see the pattern while it was still fresh. She arrived without cameras or statements, just a slim file in hand. The board members were waiting. "There's a new development," she said, calmly, "one that removes speculation." She walked them through the timeline, laid out the rulings, showed them the repeated phrasing, the copy-paste decisions, the rapid approvals, the sealed records. One board member glanced through the documents with furrowed brows. "He issued these orders before receiving responses in multiple cases?" "Yes." "And the rulings all favor the same side?" "Without exception." The lead member set the file down. "We'll need to interview internal court staff. That may include compelling testimony from Boasberg's clerks." Bondi nodded. Then came the question she had been expecting. "Are you prepared to testify if this goes public?" Without hesitation. Outside the federal building, the air was colder. A storm was building in the distance, and the wind carried the tension of something about to break. Bondi walked to her car without looking back. Across town, Judge Boasberg sat in his chambers, watching headlines swirl and phones go unanswered. He was no longer the one asking questions, he was the one being asked about, and the pattern was now out of his control. By the following week, the tension had made its way to Capitol Hill. The Judicial Review Board's inquiry had triggered conversations inside Senate offices and legal subcommittees. No one had expected a sitting federal judge like Boasberg to be under formal investigation. The quiet discomfort among lawmakers on both sides was impossible to ignore. Some were cautious, waiting for the inquiry to conclude before taking a position. Others, especially those known for championing judicial reform, began making discreet phone calls to their contacts in the media. Pam Bondi noticed it immediately. Every morning brought a new wave of opinion pieces. Some called her bold for standing up to institutional overreach. Others accused her of targeting the judiciary for personal gain. The headlines varied, but one thing was clear: the country was now paying attention. Inside her team's small downtown office, the mood had shifted. "They know we're serious now," one researcher said. "The smear pieces are proof of that," Bondi agreed. But she also knew the real fight hadn't even begun. Boasberg still had power. He still wore the robe, and even though the investigation had begun, it would take more than timelines and testimonies to unseat a federal judge. That morning, her assistant entered the room with a new document. "This came from a staffer inside the courthouse. It's a transcript request, internal. One of Boasberg's clerks requested a sealed court transcript from a case 2 years ago. But here's the issue: that case was never unsealed, and there's no reason the clerk should have had access." Bondi skimmed the document. The request had been marked confidential, but the metadata revealed it had been printed and delivered to an outside party. "Do we know who received it?" "Not yet." But Bondi had a guess. She added it to the file. Another layer in a growing pattern of judicial overreach and quiet favors. Not explosive on its own, but damaging when stacked next to everything else. That afternoon, she received an invitation from a Senate subcommittee to brief staffers on the inquiry's progress. It wasn't a hearing, not yet, just an off-the-record discussion, but it was the first sign that Congress was paying more than casual attention. She arrived alone, carrying a USB drive and a printed summary of the timeline. The briefing room was small, tucked away inside a quiet wing of the Capitol. 5 staffers from different Senate offices sat around a table, notebooks open, phones face down. One of them asked the first question: "What makes this different from other cases of questionable rulings?" Bondi didn't flinch. "This isn't about a bad judgment call, it's about a pattern that favors a specific outcome in every single case using rushed orders, sealed records, and premature rulings. That's not discretion. That's design." Another staffer leaned forward. "Have you found any financial incentive?" "Not directly, but we've uncovered links between Judge Boasberg's immediate family and legal advocacy groups that routinely benefit from his rulings. At best, it's a conflict of interest. At worst, it's coordinated." The room was silent for a moment. Then one of the staffers asked what Bondi had been waiting to hear. "Are you prepared to take this public if this continues and the board stalls?" "Yes, the public deserves to know." That answer changed the tone. The meeting ended with handshakes and guarded expressions. Bondi knew what that meant. Some offices would quietly support her, others would wait to see which way the wind blew. But the lines were starting to form. That evening, Boasberg's legal team released a second statement, this one more combative. "These recent reports are built on innuendo, not fact," it read. "Judge Boasberg's integrity remains intact, and any effort to undermine the court's independence will be met with legal recourse." They were drawing their line too. Bondi's phone buzzed. It was her DOJ contact. "You should know. There's pressure coming from above. Some in the administration are worried this is getting too big, too fast. Tell them to worry about why it's happening, not that it is." She hung up and stared at her office wall, where the case timeline now stretched across 3 rows of pins and printed emails. Each detail had a purpose, each piece connected. She didn't need public sympathy, she needed the truth to hold up when it mattered most. And now, everyone involved knew exactly what was at stake. This wasn't about paperwork anymore. It was about trust in the justice system, and what happens when that trust is quietly abused behind the safety of a robe and a locked chamber door. Pam Bondi had made her move. Now it was time to see who would stand beside her when the real pressure began. The call came just after sunset. Pam Bondi had just returned from a long meeting with her legal advisors when her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail until a single text followed. "I have information about Boasberg's internal process. I worked in his chambers. I'm ready to talk." She stared at the message for a moment. Most anonymous tips led nowhere, but something about the wording made her pause. It was direct, specific. It came from someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. She replied with a single sentence, "Where and when?" The staffer responded with a coffee shop location in D.C. The message ended with just one word, "Tomorrow." When Pam arrived the next day, the man was already seated, late 20s, clean-cut, but with a nervous energy that gave him away. He didn't introduce himself by name, just nodded and began speaking quietly. "I was one of Boasberg's clerks last year. You're not wrong about the orders." A lot of them were pre-written. Pam listened, not interrupting. The thing is, the judge didn't draft most of them himself. He had templates, dozens. He'd hand us a case, say it needed to be expedited, and then point us toward an existing order to copy. He'd say, "This one's close enough, adjust the names, clean up the details." How often? Too often. And not just immigration, anything that could draw political attention. The fast-track cases were always the same: quiet motion, quick approval, seal the file, move on. Pam leaned in slightly. And the motions? Were they legitimate? Some were, but a few, I don't think they were real. One case in particular stood out to me. The paperwork came in after the order had already been signed. I asked about it. He told me not to worry. "Did you keep anything?" The clerk reached into his coat and pulled out a flash drive. I backed up parts of the internal log system, the metadata, nothing privileged, just timestamps, docket entries, when orders were edited or accessed. I shouldn't have done it, but something felt off. I knew one day someone would ask questions. Pam took the drive. "You're putting yourself at risk, I know. But I've seen what happens when people stay silent." That night, Bondi reviewed the files. Her legal tech expert helped her decrypt the internal logs. What they found sent a chill through the room. In over a dozen instances, draft orders were opened and edited before the corresponding motions appeared in the system. Some were written days in advance. Others showed signs of being copied from external templates. A few had identical decision structures to past rulings, word for word. This is the clearest example. A restraining order that had blocked the deportation of a flagged individual, citing humanitarian grounds. The metadata showed the ruling had been prepared 3 days before the official motion arrived, using language from a previous case that had no relevance. Pam stared at the screen. He wasn't just acting fast, he was recycling decisions. This was more than misconduct, it was systemic manipulation of judicial process, hidden behind sealed records and quiet signatures. The next morning, she sent a summary of the findings to the Judicial Review Board with a request for an emergency evidentiary session. They replied within hours. Approved. Tomorrow, noon. Word of the new development began to spread behind closed doors. A reporter from a national paper contacted her requesting an off-the-record background call. "I've heard there's a digital trail," he said, "something internal." Pam didn't confirm or deny. "When this is ready, you'll know." The following day, she returned to the same federal building. This time, she carried a laptop. The board members were already seated. They looked tired, focused. One of them motioned for her to begin. Pam opened with a simple statement. "We now have confirmation that Judge Boasberg's rulings were not only irregular but in some cases prepared before any motion had been filed. This flash drive contains internal metadata logs from his chambers. These were backed up by a staffer who's now cooperating." She walked them through the timestamps, the identical rulings, the repeated phrases, the sealed orders that shared suspicious structural similarities. When she finished, the lead member leaned forward. "You're saying rulings were created in anticipation of certain motions?" "I'm saying they were constructed before any judicial process began. This isn't discretion, it's premeditation." The room went quiet. One of the members asked the question they'd all been thinking. Was there outside influence? "We believe so, yes. Advocacy groups aligned with the judge's family had access and favorable rulings that often mirrored language used in their own public campaigns." The board thanked her and recessed. Outside, Pam didn't say a word to the press. She didn't need to. Inside the courthouse, Judge Boasberg had received word of the evidentiary session. For the first time, he requested personal legal representation in the inquiry. It was a signal he knew what was coming, and now, for the first time, he was preparing to defend himself. Not as a judge, but as an individual under scrutiny. The walls were closing in. Pam Bondi had forced the hand of a man who never thought anyone would question him. And now, his answers couldn't come behind closed doors anymore. They were going to be public. The day began like any other in D.C., but everyone in the legal community knew it wasn't. For the first time since the inquiry began, Judge James Boasberg had agreed to speak, not through a statement, not through an attorney. He had requested to appear voluntarily before the Judicial Review Board in a closed session. The request was granted, and word spread quickly. Every courthouse whisper, every hallway conversation carried the same question. What was he going to say? Pam Bondi was not invited to the session, but she received a tip from one of the Review Board staffers just after noon. "He's here, he brought documents, and he's not denying the pre-written orders." She closed the folder on her desk and leaned back. He's going for justification. Boasberg's strategy, it seemed, wasn't to deny what had happened. It was to explain it away. According to a summary provided later by a board member, Boasberg opened his remarks by defending the use of judicial templates in high-volume federal courts. He said judges rely on efficiencies to manage complex dockets. He claimed the advanced drafting of rulings was common practice, necessary even to ensure cases moved swiftly. When pressed on why some of those rulings were signed before opposing counsel responded, Boasberg attributed it to clerical overlap and a heavy reliance on trusted legal assistance. He did not deny the timing, nor did he deny the sealed motions. Instead, he said the cases involved sensitive matters and that sealing records was often done to protect vulnerable parties. But when asked specifically about the email Bondi had submitted referencing an advocacy request, Boasberg faltered. He called it a poor choice of words and suggested it may have been taken out of context. He did not offer an alternate explanation. That evening, the board issued a statement to federal oversight bodies. Serious questions remain regarding the judicial conduct and procedural integrity of Judge Boasberg's rulings. The matter will now advance to a formal review phase. Pam read the statement twice. She knew what it meant. The inquiry was no longer preliminary, it was now official. She turned to her team. They're going to look deeper. Subpoenas, interviews, maybe even forensic audits. But we can't let up. If they delay, the public forgets and he walks. What do we do next? Someone asked. We bring it to the people, carefully. Pam's strategy had always been measured, but now that Boasberg had spoken and failed to offer a full defense, the moment had arrived. She agreed to a televised interview with a major news network, not a political program, not a soundbite session, a sit-down. When the interview aired, she kept her tone calm, her words precise. "What I uncovered isn't just a lapse in judgment, it's a pattern of behavior that undermines the principles of judicial impartiality. And if someone in his position is allowed to bend the rules without consequence, what does that say about the rest of the system?" The interviewer asked if she believed Boasberg should resign. "I believe the facts speak for themselves, and I believe no judge, no matter how long they've worn the robe, is above the law." The public response was immediate. Clips from the interview circulated online, hashtags trended, people began calling their representatives, and quietly, behind the scenes, lawmakers on key committees began asking questions of their own. That same week, another former clerk came forward, this time with written testimony. In it, they described a culture of pressure inside Boasberg's chambers, a rush to issue rulings, a disregard for opposing arguments, and a growing reliance on sealed decisions to avoid scrutiny. Pam received a copy of the testimony through encrypted email. She read it slowly, carefully. The final paragraph stood out. "We were told to prioritize speed over fairness, efficiency over process. I stayed quiet because I thought it was just how the system worked. Now I know it wasn't." She forwarded it to the review board. At this point, the story had grown beyond Bondi's original findings. What began as a quiet investigation into irregular filings had become a national story about judicial accountability and the growing demand for transparency inside a branch of government rarely questioned. Still, Pam knew something vital was missing: the motive. Why? Why would a federal judge take these risks, bend rules, and favor a pattern of outcomes without ever being asked to? And then, late one evening, her researcher brought in a single-page document. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't even secret. It was a grant report. A nonprofit legal advocacy group had listed Boasberg's court as part of their strategic engagement network in an annual report to donors. The term was vague, purposefully so, but it was there in black and white: Strategic Engagement Network, Federal Court, D.C. Region. Pam stared at the line. She didn't say a word, she just circled it with a red pen. Because now she had the link. The red circle around the phrase Strategic Engagement Network stayed on Pam Bondi's desk for 2 days. She stared at it every time she passed by. It wasn't an accusation, it wasn't even a smoking gun, but it was a breadcrumb, and Pam had learned long ago that real corruption rarely left obvious trails. It lived in vague language, in quiet deals, in relationships that were never declared but always mattered. Her researcher sat across from her, tapping the report. That nonprofit received over $4 million in donor funding last year. Most of it came from 2 large foundations, both politically active, both publicly aligned with immigration reform, and they've cited their court influence in private fundraising pitches. Influence was a slippery word. It didn't prove collusion, but when Pam cross-referenced the nonprofit's case involvement, the pattern became clearer. Out of 29 cases they had touched in the past year, 16 had been assigned to Boasberg's court. 13 had received favorable emergency rulings, 9 had been sealed without public explanation. The odds of that happening by coincidence were low. She leaned forward. "Get me everything on the board memberships. I want to know exactly when Boasberg's wife joined them and who else sits at that table." The researcher nodded and left the room. Pam turned back to her laptop and drafted a short statement. No names, no conclusions, just a question. Should judges be required to disclose when their family members serve on boards of organizations that benefit from their rulings? She posted it on her public social media feed and closed the tab. Within an hour, legal blogs picked it up. By evening, 3 radio hosts had already read it on air. It was subtle but effective. The following morning, a senior political reporter contacted her off the record. "I've seen what you're working on. There's talk on the Hill that this might go beyond Boasberg." Pam didn't react, and the reporter continued, "There's pressure now. The administration doesn't want this to become a full-blown judicial scandal. Some insiders are floating the idea of a quiet resignation." Pam paused. "If he steps down, this ends too quietly." She had spent weeks building a case, document by document, testimony by testimony, not to ruin a man's career, but to expose how the rules could be twisted when no one was watching. Letting him slip away with a resignation wasn't justice, not this time. Later that day, her team uncovered the final piece. a series of internal emails from the nonprofit, obtained through a FOIA request and buried inside an unrelated federal funding report. They showed communications between their legal team and a friendly circuit inside the D.C. court system. The phrase was used 3 times, once in a reference to an emergency deportation delay, once regarding a sealed humanitarian case, and once in connection to a court schedule adjustment that matched Boasberg's calendar exactly. Pam read the document in silence. Then she made the decision. She would take it to the press, not through an interview, not with opinion. She would publish the evidence. The next morning, a 3-page op-ed appeared in a major national newspaper under her name. It began simply, "Judicial independence is sacred, but independence without transparency invites abuse." She laid out the timeline, the rulings, the sealed cases, the undisclosed connections. She referenced the strategic engagement network, the board positions, and the reused legal templates. And at the heart of it all, she asked the one question that couldn't be ignored. What happens when a judge with unchecked power begins ruling in ways that consistently benefit groups tied to his own household? She didn't call for Boasberg's removal. She didn't have to. By noon, the Senate Judiciary Committee released a statement. They would be reviewing the findings to assess whether further legislative oversight of the federal judiciary is required. For the first time, lawmakers were involved. The court system could no longer handle the matter quietly. Boasberg, still silent, did not appear in court that day, or the next. Rumors swirled. His legal team had gone quiet. Several law schools pulled his name from speaking engagements. Advocacy groups that once praised his rulings issued carefully worded statements about judicial integrity. And still Pam waited. Because there was one more moment left, one more appearance that would determine how this story ended. The Judicial Review Board scheduled a final hearing. Boasberg had been invited to appear and respond under oath. If he declined, it would be seen as admission. If he appeared, he would face direct questions with no legal shield. Pam received the invitation to testify as a final witness. She folded it and placed it in her briefcase. Because the next chapter wouldn't be written in private anymore. It would happen in a room full of officials, on record, and this time the public would be watching. The room wasn't grand or televised, but it carried the weight of something final. Inside a federal hearing chamber, tucked within the walls of the Office of Judicial Conduct, 5 review board members sat at a long table. No cameras, no reporters, just chairs, microphones, and a handful of the most powerful legal professionals in the country. Across from them sat Judge James Boasberg. For the first time since the inquiry began, he wasn't in his black robe. No bench, no clerks behind him, just him and his attorney, seated before the very body now determining the future of his career. Pam Bondi entered quietly from the back. She hadn't come to watch a takedown. She came for something more important, accountability, and perhaps, finally, an honest answer. The lead board member began the proceedings with a short statement. This hearing is the result of months of investigation into procedural conduct, potential ethical breaches, and concerns about judicial impartiality related to rulings made by Judge Boasberg. Boasberg's attorney requested a brief opening. Judge Boasberg maintains that all actions taken during his tenure were within the bounds of judicial discretion. He acknowledges lapses in internal communication and has expressed willingness to support transparency reforms moving forward. Pam didn't react. She'd heard that line before. Then came the board's questions. They started simple, focused on process. Can you explain the timeline behind your emergency orders? How were certain cases prioritized over others? Why were rulings issued prior to public filings? Boasberg answered each one in a low, measured tone. The court operates under intense pressure. We often draft orders in anticipation of filings to ensure swift justice. Delays can harm petitioners. The preemptive work was never meant to subvert process. The board nodded, then moved deeper. You issued protective seals on 9 cases. In 5 of those, there was no clear rationale on the docket. Why? Boasberg hesitated for the first time. In some instances, it was to avoid unnecessary public attention on vulnerable individuals. Immigration law is sensitive. Disclosure can endanger families. The lead member tapped a document on the table. 3 of those cases were filed by the same nonprofit organization. Your wife sits on that nonprofit's advisory board. Why wasn't this disclosed? Boasberg cleared his throat. That board position is unpaid and honorary. I did not consider it to pose a conflict. My rulings were made independently. The room was quiet for several seconds. Then the board requested Pam Bondi's testimony. She stood and walked calmly to the witness chair. Do you swear to tell the truth? I do. She began by restating what had brought her there, the unusual volume of sealed rulings, the timing inconsistencies, and the identical language across multiple emergency orders. She spoke clearly and without emotion. This wasn't about personal attacks or politics. It was about data, evidence, patterns no one had wanted to look at until she forced them to. The board asked one final question. In your view, does Judge Boasberg's conduct represent intentional misuse of judicial authority? Pam looked directly at the panel. Yes, I believe the evidence shows a repeated disregard for transparency and process. These were not isolated shortcuts. They were part of a structure, one that undermined fairness in the name of expediency. She paused. No one is above scrutiny, not even the people we expect to know better. The lead member thanked her and dismissed the hearing. The room emptied slowly, no applause, no declarations, just the quiet hum of federal staffers collecting files and unplugging microphones. Pam left without speaking to anyone. 2 days later, the board's findings were released. The ruling was blunt. Judge James Boasberg is found to have repeatedly issued preemptive and improperly sealed rulings in cases involving parties with undisclosed personal ties. These actions constitute a serious breach of judicial ethics and warrant immediate disciplinary action, including formal censure and referral for disbarment proceedings. Boasberg submitted his resignation the next morning. No press conference, no farewell speech, just a letter sent to the Chief Justice and a single sentence released through his lawyer. I resign in the interest of preserving the integrity of the bench. Pam Bondi read it from her office. No satisfaction, no celebration, just quiet resolve. She had asked a question no one wanted to ask, and now a federal judge had been held accountable because of it. Later that week, she received a handwritten note from a woman in Nebraska. It said, "My husband was deported after waiting 3 years. We were told the delay was due to paperwork. Now I understand what happened. Thank you for speaking up." Pam folded the letter and placed it in her desk drawer. Because that's who this was for. Not the headlines, not the politics, but for the people who had no idea how much power could be misused behind closed doors, and who now knew that sometimes someone is still willing to open those doors and let the light in. This story leaves us with a powerful lesson. Unchecked power, even in the most trusted institutions, can erode justice when no one dares to question it. Pam Bondi's courage shows that accountability isn't just a legal principle, it's a human responsibility. In our own lives, this reminds us to speak up when something feels wrong, whether it's at work, in our communities, or even among friends. Silence can protect the powerful, but truth, backed by persistence, can shift the balance. We don't need to be attorneys general to make a difference, just people willing to open the door and let the light in. Thanks for watching this journey with us. If this story moved you, drop a comment below with your thoughts. What would you do in Bondi's shoes? Like, share, and subscribe to keep exploring stories that matter.